an attorney with the Center for Earth Jurisprudence at Barry University School of Law. The center has a special focus on Florida's springs and advancing their right to flow and support their unique ecosystems of clean, unpolluted water. I think we all know that if the springs are to be protected, we need to put limits on human activities in the spring shed. The question is whether our laws really constrain our behavior, or have they become licenses to pollute and deplete. From our perspective, one of the most serious problems confronting the springs is our current regulatory system as administered by the Department of Environmental Protection and the Water Management Districts. The existing legal protections are wholly inadequate to protect the springs from the twin threats of reduced flows and nitrate pollution. Their approach is fragmented, limited, and ultimately ineffective. They cannot possibly respond in a timely way to avert the serious ecological harm which is already well underway. And they give the public the false impression that their springs are being adequately protected when new innovative strategies are urgently needed. That seems harsh. I want to illustrate my point with an example, one of Florida's best protected springs, Wekiva Springs. Wekiva Springs, like almost all our major springs, is impaired due to nitrate pollution. The level is currently above 1 milligram per liter. In 2007, the department set the allowable nitrate standard in Wekiva at 0.286 milligrams per liter, about 6 times the level of nitrates originally present in Florida's springs. This standard requires the nitrate load going into the springs to be reduced by nearly 80%. However, for 5 years, there's been no approved plan to implement the 2007 standard. Where's the urgency? A few weeks ago, one day before the Speak Up Wekiva rally, the department finally released its draft plan for implementing the standard. For anyone who cares about this beautiful spring, the draft plan is disheartening indeed. One learns on page 4 of the plan that it only covers 1/2 of the spring shed for the Wekiva cluster of springs, including some of the important recharge areas. One cannot ignore 50% of the problem and expect the plan to be successful. Moreover, the plan does little to address the sources of nitrate which are poisoning the spring. We have good information on where the pollution comes from. 75% comes from 3 sources. 17% of the nitrate load comes from residential and golf course fertilizer. 26% of the nitrate load comes from septic tanks. 32% of the nitrate load comes from agricultural fertilizer and animal waste. If we want to protect the spring, we have to reduce the nitrate load from these 3 sources by nearly 80%. It's that simple. There really isn't another option. How does the plan propose to achieve this? It really doesn't. In order to reduce the nitrate coming from residential lawn fertilizer, all we have to do is stop fertilizing our lawns. It doesn't cost anything. We would actually save money. The plan doesn't say this. The only reference in the plan to lawn fertilizer is that it notes that the local governments have passed fertilizer ordinances. These ordinances allow for fertilizer to be applied at rates recommended by the Institute of Food and Agricultural Science. And since the evidence indicates that the recommended rates are not being exceeded, even if there was 100% compliance, the ordinances will not appreciably reduce the amount of fertilizer being applied. In fact, nitrate from this source is likely to increase with future growth in the spring shed. What about the 26% of the nitrate load generated by the 65,000 septic tanks in the spring shed? Some of the local governments have undertaken a few projects to extend sewer service to areas that previously only had septic tank systems. This is a good thing, but we're only talking about a few hundred septic tanks. That's the entire extent to which the plan addresses nitrate from septic tanks. Finally, there's the 32% of the nitrate load that comes from agriculture. Agriculture gets special treatment under the law. The pollution is to be reduced through voluntary adoption of best management practices. By law, farmers who implement the best management practices have a presumption of compliance with state water quality standards. However, that presumption of compliance is only supposed to be available if the Department of Environmental Protection verifies that the practices are effective in achieving the levels of pollution reduction established in the allocations developed by DEP. However, there are no such allocations in the Ohio plan. The plan says it was not feasible to assign detailed allocations or nutrient loads to groundwater in the primary spring contributing area. Adoption of best management practices may help, but there's no evidence that they can reduce the nitrate by anything close to 80%. And that's one of the most glaring deficiencies in the planning process. The unrealistic assumption as to the level of reduction which can be obtained by best management practices. If we were really honest about this, we would say up front that agriculture is only going to be able to reduce the nitrate load by 50%. And I think that's being wildly optimistic. If we admitted that fact, then we would see that we need to reduce the nitrate coming from lawn fertilizer and septic tanks by 100% if we're going to reach the 80% target called for in the plan. And it would be helpful to for the department to go through that process, because then we'd see that we need to take some drastic action. Why don't we just do it? Isn't it pretty clear what needs to be done? We can cut to the chase, and by statute, if we had the political will, we could ban the use of lawn fertilizer in spring shed recharge areas. We could strictly regulate septic tanks, and we could mandate best management practices for agriculture in all the spring sheds of the state. Why wait? Why not do all of that right now? That's a real plan to protect the springs. The other aspect of spring protection is guaranteeing the springs enough water to continue to flow. Currently, our water allocation system places the spring's access to water on a second-tier status below all human uses. If we do set a minimum flow for a spring, we only allocate enough water to the spring to avoid significant ecological harm. But nobody really knows what that level is, particularly when you're talking about springs whose health is already seriously compromised by nitrate pollution. Our law says that if the spring falls below or is projected to fall below the minimum within 20 years, the district must expeditiously implement a preventative recovery strategy to restore the spring to the minimum flow as soon as possible. Note, the spring doesn't have to be restored to health. It only has to be restored to the minimum level. And in doing so, the district is supposed to hold existing consumptive use permit holders harmless. The longer the delay in setting and enforcing minimum flows, the more consumptive use permits are issued, the more expensive it will be to restore the springs until the day comes when the district will decide that restoration is no longer economically feasible. The historical flow of Otter Springs was 70 cubic feet per second. In 1994, the district, at the direction of the legislature, set the annual average minimum flow at 62 cubic feet per second. We believe the spring fell below the minimum flow in 2005. In 2011, the average flow for the year was only 57 cubic feet per second. The issue of minimum flows in Otter Springs is much the same story as with nitrate pollution. Plenty of reports, studies, and media, but little action. The Water Management District has ignored the decline in flow for years. The average flow has been below the minimum for the last 2 years, and the district will still not admit there's a problem. But, you know, Otter is not the worst example of spring protection. Most of our first and second magnitude springs enjoy even less protection than Otter does on paper. The 20 largest springs in Florida do not even have minimum flows established for them, and it will be years before basin management action plans are developed for all of the large springs. The obvious failure of our current environmental regulation to protect the springs argues for a new approach. There are new models for environmental protection based on the rights of inherent nature emerging around the world. Most recently, New Zealand has recognized the Wanganui River and its tributaries as a legal entity with rights rights as an integrated living whole. 2 guardians are to be appointed to oversee the health and well-being of the river. A case in Ecuador has similarly protected the rights of waterways to flow in a case on the Roca River implemented the country's 2008 constitutional provision recognizing the rights of nature. Citizens of Vermont have begun to petition for a constitutional amendment recognizing the rights of nature, something that I hope we can see duplicated here. We need to recognize that we must learn to live within the limits of the water budgets imposed by the spring sheds, and we need to reflect those water budgets in the law. Legal water rights must be allocated to the springs at levels sufficient to protect their biological integrity, and those rights must be protected to ensure the well-being of all flow beings and the springs ecosystems for the future. Thank you.
Any questions for Rob about the rights of nature?
So if we wanted to give rights of nature here in Florida, how would we go about that?
Well, it can be at all different levels, but let's just take the spring example. A consumptive use permit holder has rights. You can't take away his water rights. You can't take away the rights of the corporations. Why not give the same equivalent right to the spring? Why is the spring the last residual user of water? The spring gets what's left over when everything else has been allocated with rights. We need to give that right, the inherent right to continue to flow and to have biological integrity to our springs. So that would be one. That's the first step. And then we need to look, as we're talking, at broader measures of the health of the spring rather than just talk about what's the maximum amount of pollution that we can dump in the water before something bad happens, which is the way our current law works.
Thank you. Sir, back here.
My question is many cases more. I'm curious, is it really a matter of writing new laws more than it is an enforcement? My understanding is there's enough laws on the books already that if we could enforce them, we could pretty much solve our current water problems.
Well, I'll use the example of the minimum flows. Florida passed a good water act in the 1970s, and it directed the water management districts to set minimum flows for the water bodies in the state. And then for the next 20 years, the water management districts ignored the law, until finally a citizen suit was brought to compel the water management districts to set minimum flows. At that point, the developer industry got worried these minimum flows could cause a problem, and so they got the law changed. They fixed it for their point of view. So now, for example, there's still the requirement to set the minimum flow, but that requirement is met if the district merely schedules the setting of the minimum flow. So no minimum flows are set, but they're just scheduled on and on into the future, that we're going to get to it next year. That was step number one. But then, and this is really where it's headed, and this is the flaw in the law, then it says, okay, now the spring is below the minimum. What's going to be the recovery strategy? It has to be a plan that not only fixes the problem of the spring, but it has to be a plan that ensures that the current use, all the other users of the water and the future users of the water also have water. So it becomes prohibitively expensive to do that. And so that's a fundamental flaw in the current law. It's not just a matter of what the agency does. Another example of that is, the agency takes the position that all it's responsible for is a decline in flow due to pumping. But if there's a decline in flow due to man-made climate change, well, that's the spring's problem. We're not going to solve that problem with our current law. And that's why, again, I think you have to come back to the idea that we have to reserve water for the spring. We have to give the spring a right to flow, to have a certain amount of water.
Thank you, Rob. I think we'll go on and stay on time. Thank you.